Hi, I'm Brad Arkin. I'm the Chief Security and Trust Officer here at Cisco, and I want to take you through our Zero Trust architecture rollout from zero to hero, how we deployed Zero Trust in 5 months. For the agenda today, we're going to start out by defining what do I mean when I say Zero Trust. Zero Trust has a lot of definitions depending who's talking. I want to define very clearly what Zero Trust means for me in the context of this description and this rollout. The next thing I want to talk about is the Zero Trust landscape. And so what does your organization have today sitting out there in the environment? And what incremental building blocks do you need to deploy in order for you to be ready for a Zero Trust rollout for your environment? And finally, I'm going to take you through exactly the different steps that we took here at Cisco to do our Zero Trust deployment. And we did it in just a few months. And so sit back, I'm going to take you through all of those details as we get into the meat of it. The first thing I want to do is make sure everyone understands what we mean when we talk about Zero Trust. Zero Trust has become a marketing term that has so many different definitions that you can apply it to just about anything. In the context here that I'm talking about Zero Trust for this presentation, the important points for us are captured here on this slide. The most important thing is we want to move beyond using user passwords and relying on them as a security control. The real focus is looking at the user certificate that we associate with a user, and then a device certificate that we associate with each particular device the user might use. And so if you have a phone, a mobile tablet, a laptop, you might have 3 different device certificates associated with one user certificate. And in combination, we know that user A has device B, and together, when you make a connection request, we can then start to ask questions around the device posture. Is this device appropriately patched? Is it configured the way it's supposed to be configured? And all of that gives us a health determination. And if we like what we're learning through that health check process, the next step would be to issue a multi-factor authentication challenge to the end user. And so this might be a push notification that the user can respond to and say, yep, that's me. I initiated the request. I'm now ready to go. Now, where things might go different is what resource the user is working to connect to. In some cases, it might be a third-party SaaS application that's hosted somewhere out on the internet. And on this diagram here, we have that indicated by Salesforce. And so if you're connected to Salesforce, then the connection would flow directly to that third-party SaaS interface. Another flavor of connection would be the user connecting to what was previously an on-prem deployed service. And in this example, we have the Cisco corporate intranet. Now, in this case, in the old days, you could only connect to this service by first initiating a VPN connection. And then once on the corporate network, you could then connect to the intranet website. What we want to move towards is basically SaaSifying this on-prem service and making it available to the user wherever they are. If they're at a Starbucks, if they're at home, if they're on an airplane, the connection should just flow through and work. And from the end user perspective, they don't need to know the difference between a third-party cloud-hosted SaaS application and an on-prem application that's managed and hosted internally by Cisco. The user experience on the back end should be the same, regardless of how it's deployed. So this is what we mean by Zero Trust. And everything else that we talk about in this presentation will be taking you through the journey of what we deployed, how we rolled it out, and how we did it so quickly to get it rolled out in just a few months. So the Cisco Zero Trust architecture, in the beginning, you've got your on-prem apps that are over on the left, and you've got your SaaS apps that are over on the right. In the middle, you've got this DMZ. And so what we want to achieve is whether you're an endpoint deployed internally within the Cisco corporate network or externally sitting in a Starbucks, sitting at home, somewhere off premise, we want to be able to create these zigzag connections so that regardless which endpoint you're sitting at, you can connect to all of these different types of services. That's the goal. And so what we find is that most people within your corporate environment today, you're going to have some kind of enterprise single sign-on. You're going to have some type of directory service, which we have here labeled with AD for Active Directory, and then some kind of identity provider. And the identity provider can do some checks to make sure, depending on which app you're trying to connect to, do you have the right permissions, are you in the right group? have you authenticated accurately? So that you're providing whatever that single or multi-factor authentication is. And so pretty much every organization looks like this in the beginning. And then the question is, how can we then deploy the zero trust components we need in order to achieve that true zero trust architecture that we defined on the previous slide? And so here at Cisco, what we did was we rolled out a few new pieces to the architecture. So starting in the middle, maybe the most important piece is the network gateway. This is what allows external endpoints, so that laptop sitting in a Starbucks, to connect through the network gateway to then get to the on-prem apps. That is probably the most interesting piece here. And there are some people who feel very threatened by this network gateway deployment, and they say, no, it's inappropriate, it's not fair. You should only connect through the VPN in order to get to your on-prem stuff. For me, I don't understand what all the fuss is about, because what is a VPN if not a different named form of network gateway that lets you go from the outside to the inside? For me, they're the exact same thing conceptually. And if you implement it properly and you configure it in a way that's consistent with your security outcomes and your policies, I think you can be just as secure with a network gateway as you would be with a VPN. And so for me, it's a new component, but from a trust perspective and the way we're relying on the architecture to keep us safe, I think it's analogous to what we have with VPNs. So that network gateway in the top center, that's the first new piece. The next piece is some kind of cloud certificate authority and multi-factor authentication service. And so we have that with the green bubble off on the right. There are other ways you could actually deploy this in a way that might be internal on-prem. In our model, we used a cloud provider to do this. And so that's deployed on the right. And that is going to deliver us the posture checks, the certificate checks that we're doing. And then another thing that we have is the cert management infrastructure, which is on the far left of this slide. And what certificate management does for us is it lets us keep track of every device certificate and every user certificate and what is associated with what, so that we can look these up, make sure a cert hasn't been revoked, make sure it's still valid and signed by the right CA. And then if all of these things pass, then we can move that device on to its next sequence in the workflow for the zero trust authentication process. And so with these new pieces here, what this allows us to do is it creates a pathway for the off-premise endpoints to connect to those on-premise apps. And we also have the ability for the on-prem endpoints to connect to the SaaS apps that are externally hosted. So all of this together now gives us what the main components are of the zero trust architecture and how the information flows go back and forth to deliver that zero trust experience that we defined on the previous slide. Okay, so some quick ground rules here in terms of what is the scale of the environment that we need to manage. So we've got well over 100,000 endpoints that are pretty evenly split between Mac and Windows. And those are just the laptops. We have a equally large number of mobile devices, which would include iOS, Android, phones, and tablets. And so it's a very large set of endpoint managed devices. And then the number of user authentications, when we rolled out our pilot, we were seeing about 10,000 a day. And this number has gone up dramatically now that we've got a general availability for the population. And in the beginning, we started with a group of about 20 applications that were previously hosted on-prem, only accessible through VPN. And through this project, we wanted to publish and expose through the network gateway so they'd be accessible to managed endpoints that are working through that zero trust workflow. And so we started with about 20. We think that there might be several hundred when it's all said and done that we're going to enroll in this process, but maybe only the top 100 or so are used widely across the company. And so we wanted to start with a core set that are really important and very basic things like the corporate intranet, the corporate directory, and things that people use every day throughout the day. And if we can get those workflows working through the zero trust architecture, then we can start to pick up, after we've gone live, the more exotic services and applications that are used by a smaller percentage of the company. And the goal here is that we wanted to include all of the different endpoint devices that our users use throughout the day. And so it's not just laptops, it's not just workstations, but it includes mobile devices, handhelds, and tablets. So this is the sort of the chessboard that we started with in terms of what we needed to get done to get zero trust rolled out in this environment. The hardest part of this entire project is making sure that everyone involved understands the transformational nature of getting the zero trust architecture rolled out. This is not an incremental change that we could just deploy a new component and then move on. We needed a lot of different teams from across the company to get involved and understand we're really looking to transform the end user experience for how they access these corporate resources and to give it the attention and the time that it deserves. And making that decision and leaping in with both feet is what allowed us to get this project done so quickly. Because everyone understood that this was not a business as usual incremental improvement, but a really dramatic before and after change. And once everyone was on board with that, they understood the change that needed to happen. Then we were able to move forward with a really good project plan and make this rollout happen very quickly. But making that decision collectively as a group across the entire company that we needed to leap, that was definitely the hardest part of the project. And so having made that decision, the next part for us became just a matter of executing across the timeline. And so we started small in the lab, getting the components working together to prove that it can work, and then building out the infrastructure that we know it'll scale for the load that we intend to deploy on this environment. And then getting ready for the pilot group, and the pilot had 35,000 users in it. So it was a very big set of users that we went forward with a pilot and about 20 applications that we did when we did the initial go live. And then from there, we were able to scale out to cover the rest of the company and then start to ramp up the number of applications that are supported. And as we got that rolled out, we didn't have to do as much advertising because people would click a link in their email, it would just open up in the browser. They weren't on VPN. They didn't even realize they're using the zero trust architecture because everything had happened behind the scenes where we were deploying the certificates out to these endpoints, getting the network gateway configured, and getting all the browsers configured so that when you just click the link, it would just work. And so for the end users, for most of them, no training, no direct outreach or contact points required because it worked the way they expected it to, instead of getting an error message that said, oh, you've got to connect to VPN. And so that was really satisfying to see the usage numbers go up so dramatically once we went live. So now that we are live, the next steps here are expanding this zero trust architecture to include the mobile endpoints. So you get the same kind of experience that you have today from the laptops working on the mobile devices as well. We also want to make it a lot easier to onboard future applications so that when they're connecting in, getting a new application onboarded and getting that connected into the zero trust architecture should be as easy as possible. So for every new acquisition we make, we can get them onboarded and enrolled in the zero trust architecture as seamlessly as we can. And then also looking at understanding how do we support partners, third parties that we work with, where they may not be on managed endpoints, but they're using their own corporate hardware. They still need to connect to certain services. And so how are we going to handle those types of edge cases, which are a little bit more exotic than what we had supported in the initial rollout? All of that is to come for us, but the initial deployment from when we started the project to when we went live, just a few months. The communication goals that we had here was to make sure that every team that we needed involved in the critical path of the project deployment understood their role, understood the transformational nature of the work that we were deploying, and that it wasn't something they could defer for a year or 2 years, but they needed to get lined up to the aggressive schedule that we had put forward. And making sure those folks understood the priority, understood they couldn't say no thanks, but they could say, I need extra help, I need more resources, I need help adjusting my priorities to make room for this. That was really one of the biggest communication goals. For the rest of the end users, it was just saying, hey, it's coming, stay tuned, things are going to change. If you're very perceptive of your surroundings, you might notice that the workflows are evolving. Don't be scared, here's what's happening in the background. And so getting that information rolled out to the broader population was there, but that was more for folks that would be interested. The main focus of the communication for the critical path project teams was to make sure they understood they're involved in helping to transform the company and how we connect in from external endpoints to these on-prem applications. We did a lot of work at sprinkling the news that this project was coming when we had all hands meetings. So with our CIO and me talking with each other, my boss had some staff meetings where we would talk about the project and potential headaches or friction that we were running into. And all of these things helped to keep the pressure on so that if we did stumble in the project execution, we could spot that quickly, bring in the incremental resources we needed to get unstuck, and then keep moving. And that proved to be really, really helpful for us. The other thing was very useful was a steady cadence of communication to project stakeholders that's just in the form of a Friday afternoon email. And so each week, leaders would get this email and it'd say, hey, we're 7 days closer to going live. Here's the countdown timer. Here's what we got done in the past week. Here's what's coming up next. And there's a section labeled things where we're stuck, where we're feeling blocked, things where we need help. And so we could then get attention over the weekend and come in Monday morning to get these things unblocked and then keep moving. And that was the goal for the communications, to make sure that we didn't slow down or get stuck going down some rabbit hole that might take us weeks to recover from. So in the end, what we got from this was a vastly improved end user experience for what it's like to connect from an external endpoint to an on-premise application. We did so, not only did we not reduce our security posture, but we enhanced it because we're now getting these moment-to-moment posture and health checks of the endpoint and the way it's configured. And so if someone makes a bad mistake and they misconfigure something throughout the day, we can spot that and intervene and have the infrastructure in place to give a message to the user on how to create corrective action before they're able to access the sensitive resources they desire. And so being able to intervene right at that moment, it's allowed us to maintain much better security hygiene for the fleet and also to reach people right when they're looking to access the information as opposed to doing something after the fact. And that's been really helpful for us. And what we now have with this new set of checkpoints is basically a broader set of governance opportunities. And overall, this is going to provide building blocks for us to deploy new security capabilities in the future. That's going to make me feel much more confident as we meet the new threats that we see in the world that we're living in. And so for all of you, my goals today with our time together is that you had the chance to learn about how to take your current deployment and infrastructure, which likely doesn't have any network gateway or these certificate management components, and then what are the incremental building blocks that you need to deploy in order to get ready for zero trust. We define what zero trust means in this context because it's become a term that can be very broadly applied to a lot of situations. And what are the different steps and milestones in your project plan that you need to have in place in order to have a successful rollout? And that this is not the kind of project that has to take 3 years. It's something that we can squeeze in and do a lot tighter. And in this environment, with a very large set of user deployments, we're able to roll this out while 100% of the population is working from home in just a few months. And finally, some best practices around how to loop in and leverage your stakeholder community and make sure that you have good communication going back and forth so that when you do hit points of friction in the project, you're able to clear those and keep going and keep up with the project schedule. The Zero Trust architecture rollout was a very exciting project for us. It allowed us to completely change the way the end users within our environment access their services that they need to get their jobs done. And we got it done in such a short period of time. This involved not just the communication work we had, the aggressive technology rollout, but a lot of people coming together and understanding from the beginning that this is a transformative project for how the company rolls out new technology that's touching every corner of our workflow. It was a lot of fun to share these details with you, and I'm really happy if you have questions to ask, we can talk about it.